All right, I believe that we are live. If we aren't, I'm sure I'll get a note in the chat telling me that we are not live, but I will assume that we are. Welcome to Word on the Street Live, which is usually co-hosted by my partner in crime, Elon Goldenberg, our Chief Policy Officer here at J Street. But Elon is traveling for work today, and I've missed a couple of these myself. So I am flying solo this week, which is the first time I think that I've done that without Elon or without another co-host. So I'm very excited to be here. We are just coming off of the back end of our J Street National Leadership Summit. We had hundreds of J Street folks in Washington, D.C. We spent some time on Capitol Hill. It is a very, very fraught time here in Washington. It is not just, of course, on J Street issues. We have 2 weeks to go until the government funding deadline and meeting with senators and members of Congress and hearing perspectives on this moment and how to best position, particularly the Democratic Party in light of the pressures has been fascinating. But there's also a lot of pressure on senators as well as representatives to address in a new and stronger way what is happening in the region as Israel this week begins its full-on ground invasion of Gaza City against the best advice of the military and other security experts. And next week we head to the UN General Assembly, where we're going to see a spate of countries announcing in one form or another recognition of the state of Palestine. I still believe that on Monday there will be a very big conference on the two-state solution and bringing together a range of countries and actors to show the international community's support, pretty much unanimous support at this point for the creation of a Palestinian state other than Israel and the Trump administration. There's a lot of congressional activity designed to both show support for the process of recognition. There's a letter from Ro Khanna that we've discussed on Word on the Street Live before. There's going to be a Senate resolution that's dropping, I believe, today from Senator Merkley. And then there are a lot of vehicles that are addressing the humanitarian situation and also U.S. provision of arms. And it is a very, very active and fraught time in the region. With this invasion beginning, but also very fraught here in American politics, with the pressures really mounting on elected officials to speak out and do something about all of this. So next week we'll be back with Word on the Street Live with Elon, and I will be together, and we'll talk a little bit more about what happens, I'm sure, at the UN. We do this every Wednesday, 4 p.m. Eastern, live, and hope that folks are enjoying the new organizational form that the Word on the Street Substack is taking. Please do urge friends, family, colleagues to subscribe. So with all of this as background, another big thing happens every early September besides the UN General Assembly, and that is students go back to school. And we have, I have still got one kid in college who is starting classes, and the other one is actually starting work in the real world because she just graduated. So you all have that to look forward to. But I am very excited to be joined today by three tremendous student leaders in the Jewish community, in the pro-Israel community, in the Israel-Palestine peace community, working to try to find a more sensible path forward, not only on college campuses, but more broadly on all of these issues. I'll make a quick introduction of each of them, and then when I have gotten something wrong, you all will chime in and let me know what I've got wrong, and I'm definitely anxious to hear from each of you. So I'm joined, first of all, I'm going to start with Princeton, which is just a home field preference here, that Hannah Gabelnick is a senior at Princeton University studying public and international affairs, and that's the same major that I had, so it's great to know, and minoring in journalism. From Buffalo, Hannah spends a lot of time working in the Jewish community. Even in high school, she was working for the Buffalo Jewish Community Relations Council. She's currently co-chair of J Street U at Princeton and is president of Princeton's Reform Jewish Community. And I didn't know that the Reform Jewish Community would have a president at Princeton, so that's very exciting. They certainly didn't in my day. That is a new development. Next up, Matan Berg, who's a junior at the University of Michigan. He is studying philosophy, politics, and economics, another version of PPE. This is a version that I didn't know. So it is great to see Matan. He is minoring as well in public policy. He's vice president at the University of Michigan Hillel. He was president of the school's chapter of J Street U. He's now a Midwest vice president for J Street U nationally. So welcome to Matan. And then Tova Kaplan is a senior at Harvard studying government and economics. You're from Chicago. And founded Students for Freedom, a broad coalition of Harvard students that is urging the university to stand up against federal attacks on academic freedom and the rights of students. We're going to have a lot to talk about on all of those fronts. So let me just say, let's start with an opening question, which is, how are you guys doing? How is the start of the semester? It does feel from Washington, with no connection whatsoever to reality here, that things are a little bit quieter than perhaps they have been. So let's just go down the line and start with Hannah, Matan, and then Tova. How are you doing, and what is the atmosphere on campus as you are getting started in the new year?
Yeah, and thank you so much for hosting us today. It's really great to be here. Personally, I think we've had a pretty good start to the semester. I think compared to a year ago, coming back to school in the fall of 2024, after the encampments had happened in the spring, we came back kind of holding our breath, not really certain what was going to happen come fall. Were these protests going to continue? How are Jewish communities feeling on campus? But honestly, like after a year since that's been happening, things feel more stable, things feel calm. Not to say that there aren't tense moments and definitely tension between students on campus, between institutions on campus, especially now navigating the new federal world that we're living in and the impact it has on in our communities. But honestly, comparatively, things are feeling relatively good. And I'll
How
pass.
about in Ann Arbor, Matan? What's happening with Michigan?
Yeah, well, first, thanks so much for having me and us here. It's always an honor to be on a panel with you, Jeremy. Your leadership really has just inspired me for many years. I'll say that um, it's quiet comparatively. I agree with that assessment. In one sense, that's hard because I think the reality we're seeing in the United States and Israel, Palestine. Doesn't seem like it should reflect that. Like, maybe there should be some noise, but on the other hand, I do think it allows us to redirect our attention. Like you said, in Washington, maybe there's not as much clamoring about what's happening on campuses, and that can be a good thing to direct the focus where it needs to be.
Yeah. And Tova, how about at Harvard, which of course is ground zero for a lot of these tensions?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think a tornado would be calmer than last semester at Harvard.
Yeah.
But we had a lot of sort of chaos at the tail end of last semester and over the summer, where specifically related to international students, the Trump administration attempted to revoke Harvard's authorization to host international students. So when a lot of my friends left campus, they didn't know whether they would be let back in, which is obviously scary. But luckily, it seems like a pretty calm start to the semester. We actually had a big win in court for Harvard, where Judge
Right.
Burroughs sort of restored our funding for the time being. And actually, in her, I really encourage everyone to read her ruling. It actually echoed a lot of sort of the sentiments that Jewish students on Harvard's campus had been advocating for, saying that campus anti-Semitism is a huge problem. We agree, we want to tackle it, but the Trump administration's efforts are not helping, and they're not ultimately about anti-Semitism. So I think it's been calm, it's been better, but we are still kind of holding our breaths to see what the next moves are with the Trump administration. Indications show that Harvard is in talks with the Trump administration to potentially make some sort of deal, although that seems less likely with the recent ruling. But I think it's sort of a wait and see situation. Students for Freedom had a rally a couple weekends ago to sort of right after the ruling went into effect to urge Harvard to hold the line, to continue to fight in court and to not preemptively make a deal with the Trump administration. We got good attendance on that and had a lot of different speakers, but much more calm than last semester.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, if I were in college, I remember I was in college when Ronald Reagan was elected, and we thought at that point, from the more progressive and liberal students, we had this sense of, oh my God, the world is ending. And it now, of course, I look back and those were the good old days relative to what we have now. But it is really interesting. There's so much happening to take apart our country, and there's so much reason to be in the streets, and there's so much reason to be making noise that you would actually think that there would be a relatively larger voice and a larger sense of outrage on college campuses. Matan, let me start with you on this round. Anti-Semitism, no question, not only since October 7th, but even before, we have been seeing a rise in anti-Semitism around the country. And there's no denying that. It doesn't matter how you decide to count things or if you change the way statistics are counted. There is a rise. But I would love to get the three of you, your personal experience with anti-Semitism on your campuses, because so often people from outside campus and from outside college life are speaking for students. And it's so important to get the student perspective on just how big a problem is it and what is your personal experience of it. We'll start with Matan.
Yeah, like you said, no doubt whatsoever that anti-Semitism is rising. It's real. It's present on college campuses, both from the left and right. Obviously, on a college campus, you're likely to see more anti-Semitism from the left, which has been the case. And it's unfortunate. Like I said, things have been quieter, but my school's Hillel has been defaced and vandalized with swastikas. A Jewish student was attacked, I believe, on Shabbat just for, you know, someone asked him if he was Jewish and then he was assaulted. Um, we've had rhetoric employed, unfortunately, at protests that likely does cross that line from legitimate criticism of Israel into anti-Semitism, and that's a hard thing to grapple with, but it's real and it's there, and I think for me and people who share our desire for peace, part of that is understanding that just because you frame and define anti-Semitism in a robust manner doesn't mean that you're weaker in combating it. Actually, maybe it means we're stronger. And it's still important to do that and to make sure we're being diligent about combating anti-Semitism, but doing it in a way that's thoughtful.
And over to you at Princeton, and just curious what your personal experience has been about anti-Semitic incidents, and have you felt it personally? Do your friends and colleagues feel it personally?
Yeah, so I think I'm very lucky that I haven't personally experienced any anti-Semitic incidents for myself. That being said, there definitely have been some isolated incidents. Just over the summer, there was a swastika painted in one of the graduate student housing, like apartment buildings. Most recently, there's also been some graffiti in town that has been, being dealt with. Of course, we've had also incidents at some of the pro-Palestinian protests, especially 2 springs ago, but also a couple last spring of anti-Semitic slurs being, hurled at students. But truthfully, despite some of these isolated incidents, and these are really serious instances, I think as a whole, our Jewish community at Princeton really has felt quite safe. And like personally speaking on behalf of my friends, we have not felt like we've had to hide our identities or change what we're doing, change the way that we're discussing our Jewish identities, or, are we going to Shabbat? Are we going to our Hillel? And I think that's been really important that really, for the most part, Jewish students at Princeton feel safe. We're visibly able to express our identities without fear. And we really honestly have a thriving Jewish community. And again, that being said, there are these instances, and those instances need to be addressed. But for the most part, I feel like these instances have been addressed properly. And that's really important.
And Tova, Harvard has gotten the national reputation that it is a real ground zero for anti-Semitism. I mean, it just gets naturally a lot of attention. But give us your personal take on it, actual lived experience of the last few years. You're a senior now, right? Is that correct? So you've had several years to witness this. So let us know what you're experiencing.
Yeah, so I really echoes Hannah's experience. So I will say I have personally felt really welcomed and safe in the Jewish community. Obviously, after October 7th, which I was on campus for, it was a very heavy time. Campus has been very polarized, and my classmates have often said things that felt crossed the line, made me uncomfortable. I am very proud to be Jewish. I made a point to always wear my Jewish star for, a year after October 7th, and I'm not unsafe. That being said, I know my classmates have expressed that they felt unsafe or had been the victim of anti-Semitic experiences. I know some people had mezuzahs ripped off their doors, but I will say I do think that Harvard's reputation for being a certain cesspool of anti-Semitism is not particularly warranted. I think there are incidents like any other school, and they're horrible. As a Jewish student, I want them to be addressed. But it seems like the school has really mobilized to address it, and certainly how the Trump administration is painting the school I think is politically motivated and politically motivated in a way that's not about Jewish students. I will say, actually, in preparation for this call, we were talking about experiences with right-wing anti-Semitism, and I first said, "Oh, I don't think I've experienced that. Don't ask me that question." And then I got home, and there was a pamphlet in my mailbox, as it was put in every undergraduate's mailbox, from a student publication at Harvard, where an author literally quoted Hitler saying in a piece against immigration from non-white and non-Christian people, literally using a Hitler quote saying Germany is for the Germans, America is for the Americans, and endorsing saying, why are we letting people into our country that the Spanish Inquisition kicked out? Which I didn't even know was a reactionary point that existed. Like, that's so far reactionary that it goes back to the Spanish Inquisition. But I think instances like that show me, unfortunately, there is a lot of hate alive on campus, and it's not just coming from the left. It certainly is coming from the left, but it's not. I think there's sort of a disproportionate amount of attention on left-wing anti-Semitism that's often politically motivated, whereas I think we should be calling it out on all ends of the spectrum and say that, it's unacceptable not because it's coming from a Democrat or from a Republican, but because it's hateful. So that's my take.
So I'm just curious, when I have social dinners with my peers, all of whom are parents of kids in college at this point, this is the number one topic of conversation. I mean, they know what I do for a living, so I think that probably drives the conversation in this direction. That may not be what every dinner table is discussing in my peer group, but the perception across the parent generation of what is happening on campus is so different than the reality that the three of you just described. I mean, and the parents to be, the ones who are parents of juniors and seniors in high school, who are fearful. I mean, there's literally a sense of fear about sending their kids to one of these liberal arts elite academic institutions for fear of what may happen to them. Do you have experiences of engaging with your parents or with your friends' parents or your parents' friends where they bring this to you and you are just talking, I'm from Mars, you're from Venus, because this is just not the world that I'm living in? Let me start with Tova this time.
Yeah, definitely. I did a trip to Israel with my a cappella group last spring, which is a very nerdy extracurricular, but I love it. And it was so funny because we were touring all these places. It was a very heavy time. All the Israelis were asking us whether we were okay and whether we were safe. My Israeli family would call me and say, "Oh my gosh, are you feeling okay? Like, do you need any help?" And I'm like, I'm not the one who, you're in much more danger than I am. But I will say, I think it comes from real concern. I think it comes from good faith. But I do feel that there's a mismatch between the reality for students on campus and what the perception is among people who are not on campus, and especially our parents and grandparents' generation. I think it comes from the sort of good-natured impulse to worry about your children, but also these incidents do happen and they're real. But when they happen, sort of the media doesn't report on all of the great experiences of Jewish students on campus. And so very understandably, these incidents sort of occupy a lot of space because they're very jarring. But they sort of, that combined with, I mean, I don't think we can talk about this discussion without bringing up how the Trump administration has used the issue of campus anti-Semitism specifically as one of its tools to dismantle the institutions of higher education. We've seen that at Harvard. It hasn't been the only one. It kind of depends on the school, but I think that sort of natural media space combined with like a very conscious political effort to sort of polarize and politicize campus anti-Semitism and use it as a stumbling block for higher education, I think leads to this environment that we're seeing.
Hannah, I'm just curious, this is obviously something you talk about a lot because you're very active in the Jewish community. I mean, you're involved in a number of different Jewish organizations on campus, but for the broader Jewish student population, do they sit around and discuss this on a regular basis, or is this just, you know, the side conversation that we're all having, but everybody's just leading their normal lives? What's your perspective on how much this becomes a central part of the experience at college?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question because when I think about some of my closest friends, those who are often in J Street with me, a lot of my other Jewish friends are not really as politically involved in thinking about this. Obviously, I should rephrase, we are all thinking about this, but I think for the most part, we are all going about our normal day-to-day lives. And for me, as president of our Reform Jewish community, that's planning events, we're planning high holiday services and apple picking and activities and really going about as if, we don't really have this backdrop of this war that's continuing, obviously the hostages who are still being held hostage. And in some of my conversations with maybe friends who are not as political, maybe not studying politics or public policy in their day-to-day lives, they really are just kind of I don't really know how to say it. Like we all kind of have this understanding of what's going on, but it's not really coming up as dedicated forms of conversation. And we see that in, I'm hosting these dialogue events at our J Street chapter, trying to get people to come to the table and talk about some of these hard conversations about different perspectives, including about is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? Where do we draw that line? And what's going on with the Trump administration? And why are our library hours slashed in half now? Because we just had over $200 million of federal funding cut. And I think this speaks to your point about what's going on in Washington is that things are quiet and things are quiet on campus. And even though this is impacting all of our lives as students, there isn't a large desire from, I think, the average student to really sit down and think about it more than just kind of like a side conversation. I hope that answered your question.
And Matan, wondering, you're also obviously very much engaged in the heart of the mainstream Jewish establishment of Michigan. The anti-Semitism issue is one thing. Is the Israel-Palestine conflict, what is happening in Gaza, is that being regularly discussed by a broad range of students, or is it just something that's left to the side because it's just too divisive?
Um, there are definitely people discussing it, and I'm definitely one of them. So like the people I interact with are probably a little more likely to
Yeah, this
talk
is a
about it.
self-selected group. I mean, I will say that, so, but in the broader Jewish
But
world,
yeah, more broadly, I mean, I'm also involved with, our reform community, and we're planning high holiday services too, and planning a tashlich, and it's not like the big thing that everyone's talking about. Sometimes when we're with friends or colleagues, it's something we discuss because
so we
it's
are
real and it's
losing
serious, and
Matan a little bit in and out.
sometimes we feel. Um,
Matan, we're losing you a little bit
oh,
in
can
and
you hear
out.
me?
Yeah, unfortunately, you're coming in and out a little bit. Try one more time, and if not, we may have to just
Can you
go
hear
over
me
to.
now?
Yes.
How am I
All
doing
right.
now?
I unfortunately think the connection is not
Am I
strong
here?
enough for right now. So let's give it a minute, and I'm going to go to Tova, and then we'll come back to you. Um, what would you say in terms of the pro-Palestinian world at Harvard and the activism that maybe is, a little bit quieter right now, but undoubtedly will be back? You talked a little bit about the line between criticism of Israel and when it crosses into anti-Semitism, and I'm curious how you've seen that line navigated and whether you feel that there is a tendency for all protests to end up in a space that ends up sounding anti-Semitic, or is there an effort to try to find nuance? What is your experience within the protest movement?
Well, I think it's a good question. I personally haven't been particularly involved at all in sort of Palestinian or pro-Israel sort of rallies. So I sort of sidestepped the most contentious areas. But I think certainly it's not true that all protest or all speech turns into anti-Semitism. I think where it's crossed where it's crossed the line, it's been from a very small minority of students, even within those sorts of more radical pro-Palestinian groups or pro-Israel groups. And I think, as I mentioned before, that sort of extrapolated to encompass all of the student activist community. I think by and large, students on campus were in community with each other. And especially now, as we've put some distance between the most contentious protests on campus, especially at a place like Harvard, where it was just so foundational to all of our college experiences living through that. I think there have been a lot of efforts from students to sort of encourage dialogue with each other. Actually, at one of our, not to be self-promotional, but at one of the Students for Freedom protests, what we found is that sort of the issues of attacks on higher education have often brought together groups of people from, sides of the issue who you would never have thought would be together. So at one of our protests, we got media coverage because we had a former president of Hillel who's a very strong, like pro-Israel activist, also been very outspoken about campus anti-Semitism. And he gave a speech at our rally talking about how he felt anti-Semitism on campus had been weaponized by the Trump administration to attack international classmates. He was introduced by a pretty prominent pro-Palestinian organizer on our campus who had been involved in a lot of the headline-grabbing protests. And that sort of snapshot was taken as an example of how dire this moment is for our democratic institutions and for university institutions, that it's actually increasingly starting to bring students together. I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I do think there are those sort of moments of light where we've seen that, and that's been giving me hope.
So we're here on Word on the Street Live, talking with three J Street U and other organizational Jewish leaders from three great college campuses, Michigan, Harvard, and Princeton. And if you have any questions for us, please do put them in the chat and let us know. We'll try to address them. I want to throw out one to the group that picks up, Tova, on this question of can we bridge some divides, because we've got some larger fish to fry here, that comes from a guy who actually, I think it was you, Tova, who worked at the JCRC. Was that you that worked at the JCRC before, or was that Hannah?
That was me.
That was Hannah. Okay, well, the person who's asking this question, I happen to know, worked in the National Association of the Community Relations Councils for decades, and he is wondering whether there is any openness now that we're 2 years on, to some bridge building with Arab students who might be interested in working towards peace, as opposed to just working on a pro-Palestine agenda. Do any of you see any opening on any of the three campuses for that kind of bridge building? And Hannah, I see you nodding, so I'll start with you.
So this is something that Princeton's J Street U chapter has really tried to work on. When we host dialogue events that are really meant to bring together people of different perspectives, we've started to gain a broader amount of people who come from the more right-wing Jewish side, maybe Israeli students who served in the IDF, who come and share their perspectives. And those perspectives are really essential for my understanding of the conflict and for the students who are coming, their understanding of the conflict. Despite repeated efforts to try to build bridges to some Muslim and Arab students, I think that the word Zionist is honestly has been a barrier. And I think that this is reflected in the article. I'm not sure if you'll mention it in full, but the Atlantic piece that you had brought up earlier. I don't know if you want to give our listeners maybe a brief, I don't know if that's territory you want to get into now.
Yeah, sure. Well, since you raise it, I mean, what I had sent around to all three of our guests today a piece that was done by a Stanford student named Theo Baker, who's a wonderful writer, and he wrote this piece that ended up in the Atlantic last year. And it's called "The War on Stanford," and it's a pretty bleak picture of the way in which the debates and discussions and arguments have broken down on the campus, and the fierceness of some of the rhetoric coming at Jewish students and students who might want to affiliate as "quote unquote" pro-Israel or even Zionist. And it's a pretty harsh picture of what life was like at Stanford. So
But
Did that resonate with you?
yeah, and I think that, I mean, one of the reasons I joined J Street and really admire the work that J Street does is that we're able to reclaim the word Zionist and not make it be that word be able to associate with criticism of Israel and criticism of the war, and also a world in which Israelis and Palestinians can coexist peacefully. And you're going back to your question of if there is hope. What I have found recently is that there's a new group on campus run by actually an Israeli professor who she has no labels. The group is called Third Space. The idea is that you come in, there are no labels. And I think that there's a lot of value in having labels and J Street taking on that Zionist label. But her approach is that we have no labels. There's no like pre-existing conditions for being at the group. It's just you want to sit down and talk. And that has garnered some of the more interfaith and bringing together both Jewish and Muslim and Arab students. And I think, we have to be creative. And I've been able to meet more students this way and college administrators this way who have different faith and experience backgrounds than I do. And trying to spread the word about J Street through, I guess, this like alternative vehicle. So going back to your question, I think that there is hope. I think that we need to be creative and think about the ways that we are putting together these dialogue and bridge building efforts and not necessarily branding them with one ideal or value.
So Matan, I see that your picture is moving, so perhaps the audio and video are now working a little bit better. But I'm curious either if you wanted to share what you were saying before, or if you want to address this question, because I know at Michigan you've got a very substantial mix of Jewish and Arab American students, Palestinian American students, and I'm curious what you see this year, and even maybe at the end of last year. Is there a space beginning to open up for some communication across this divide yet on campus, and where does J Street U fit into that?
Yeah, it certainly hasn't been easy. You're right. We have a big mix of Arabs and Jews on our campus, Palestinians, Israelis as well. Um, there are individual connections being made between Jews and Arabs that I don't want to diminish, and I think those are beautiful. And I'm looking forward to seeing those continue to develop. On the whole, that space is still not there, unfortunately. I think the infrastructure for Jewish Arab dialogue was not built prior to October 7th. And so expecting it to sort of be developed after, especially, before, God willing, there's a ceasefire someday soon. But until then, I do think it's just very difficult given the contentious nature of the labels, things like that. I did once go while the encampment was at the University of Michigan. I went to look. I brought with me a flag that it was like half Israeli flag, half Palestinian flag. And I carried it just to sort of see what would happen, maybe because I'm an instigator, I don't know. But um, and you know, some the sort of people like, running the encampment, so to speak, were very much against anyone coming up to talk to me, but some people did anyway. Um, and the conversations we had were obviously not perfect. We didn't agree on like the framework for what land swaps are going to happen, what kind of solution. But there are people who are on an individual level willing to talk to each other. Um, it's our job as communities to figure out how to really bolster the connections when hopefully things start to get a little better.
Yeah, I think it's very hard in the rawness of the moment. I mean, we're literally witnessing the invasion of Gaza City in real time. Um, People are still starving. There is still a disastrous situation in real time, and that is not the easiest time to begin to do this. And so hopefully some of these individual connections, when and if the time it does come that the fighting comes to an end, we reach a ceasefire, there can be a chance to make some of those individual connections a little bit more systematic. Tova, I want to pick back up on the Theo Baker piece. I'm about to do a podcast actually with Theo in about 30 minutes. So I am really curious to get the reaction. Part of the thesis, just so for folks who didn't read this piece, part of the thesis is that the Israel-Palestine issue on college campuses and in progressive spaces, I would extend it from just being a campus issue, but progressive activists finding their voice on this issue. He sort of attributes a certain part of the generational way that your cohort, I mean, in that, in your age range, has I think the way he puts it is we're very used to just doing everything exactly so that you can rise to the top and make it into the top places. And so you check the right boxes and you say the right things and you learn what the right language is. And his thesis is that at the moment, to be a leader of the progressive movement, to be, in that cohort, then you've got to just leap out front on the Israel issue and start using all the words and making litmus tests. And it's actually just part of a cultural problem of the way the generation has been sort of trained to find success and leadership. And I'm curious if there's any resonance to that. Do you see anything about the performative nature of some of this among your peers? Not meaning for you to call out any of your peers publicly here, but
Yeah, I have a list. No. I read the article. I thought it was really well written, and I agree with sort of the aspect that we as sort of young people who grew up in the information age social media environment are sort of trained to, as we all are, pay the most attention to the most extreme voices, or that I certainly felt a few years ago that, this issue was really divisive, and for a lot of people on the left really split it apart. However, actually was co-president of the Harvard College Democrats from the spring of 2020, 2024, and then the previous spring. And at least in my personal experience, I actually felt that on the left, I was able to lead that organization and did my best to lead with sort of empathy and having we saw ourselves as a big tent organization. We had members under our umbrella who were Jewish and, openly identified as Zionist and brought that identity to our meetings. We also had students who were active in the encampment and had very different views. And it was really important to me to foster a space where people could talk to each other openly. That's certainly not all progressive spaces. So maybe others, certainly, I know Jewish students have felt that, especially the Zionist label and identity is sometimes used as a litmus test. So I think it just depends. I will say, I think one thing that's important to bring into this discussion is, at least on Harvard's campus, it feels like this issue of free speech and ideological deportation has brought a lot of people together, because increasingly it feels like, though Jewish or Zionist students might feel uncomfortable with certain speech that's said on the left, now when you bring in the political factor of the Trump administration sort of openly arresting or deporting students for expressing certain viewpoints, I don't think it's been emphasized enough just in general media discussion how much that impacts campus speech, and what outraged students have been on that. Like, it's sort of hard to talk about whether we've had spaces where we can have this sort of intercultural dialogue when a lot of people are afraid to speak out at all. I guess the point I'm trying to make is I certainly think there are more extreme sort of radical voices, but I think what I've actually found, especially this year, is that the majority of students are actually afraid to speak out, which is something I didn't encounter even a few years ago being active in campus life. Like, I'm encountering the new freshmen now. I was just talking to one yesterday, and she was saying it came to campus and expected Harvard to be this hotbed of political activity and controversy. But actually, increasing what she found was that students were terrified to speak out. They would not go to a rally of any kind for any political issue. They would never want to publicly sign their name to a statement. I actually wrote a letter with my roommate last year where we said, as we're Jewish students, we think campus anti-Semitism is a problem, but we disagree with the Trump administration's approach. And we went person to person, canvassing in Hillel, just asking people if they could sign. People were terrified. Like, I don't think the older generation realizes what it looks like to look in someone's eyes on a campus in the United States and see genuine fear. Like, I have Jewish international friends who are terrified that if they publicly signed their name on something that was so by design inoffensive, that they would be deported or that they would not be let into the country. And so I think that that's a really key aspect happening now. I also think, on the other hand, it's brought people together, like that example I shared earlier. But I also think like people who are on totally different sides of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, who wouldn't even have been in the same room together, now coming together to take a really powerful stand that, like, I can disagree with what you're saying. I can find it offensive even, and yet I still think you should have the right to say that. And that's an attitude that's certainly protected Jews, right? But it's just built this foundation of American democracy that keeps us all safe. So not to get on my high horse, but I think that's important to bring up.
Stay on that high horse. Hannah, I know you want to get in here.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to Tova's story about leading her college Democrats chapter, and that I, for a long time, I thought that we have like a progressive coalition on campus. And I'd heard from some students who were a part of this, and this really encompasses a wide range of progressive groups from reproductive justice to climate, also to anti-Zionist, Jewish groups and Students for Justice in Palestine, all kind of fall under this coalition group. And I had heard some whispers of people bringing up J Street in this meeting, specifically from some other friends of mine who had suggested that maybe we could be a part of some of their events. And it was immediately brought with, well, they're Zionist, so we don't want them involved. And this was a year ago. And then come following the election of Trump, they had a How to Combat Trump event. And I said, can J Street come and be a part of this? And we were met with a resounding yes. And I really was really impressed and excited. I don't know what had shifted within their leadership dynamics, but that going back to your original question, that was no longer a barrier or a litmus test. And after the event, they posted on Instagram, and there were a whole bunch of comments from people who I think were claiming to be alumni, but some people were like, they're just bots, and I don't know, who are like, why would you let those Zionists in? They're not really progressive. And I was really nervous that that would mean that they wouldn't want us to be working with them in the future. And so I reached out to the person who ran the event and was like, can we take these comments down, or what should we do? And like, is this making you rethink our partnership? And he was like, we have the same values. We stand for peace. I don't care what your label is. You belong in this space with us. And for me, that was such a resounding shift, I think, than a lot of the dynamics we saw during the encampment. And that also really served as a motivation for me of like, how do we bring people together? And again, tying it back to to the article, that while this kind of black and white litmus test, I do unfortunately think does make up a lot of what the progressive community is thinking and feeling. I'm also thinking a lot about the New York City mayoral election and Mamdani winning, and a lot of these conversations about like not wanting nuance. And that was one story that really gave me hope that we can move beyond some of these labels and preconceived notions that we have about each other and our political beliefs, and hopefully, work towards our shared goal, which is peace. And that's really important right now.
Yeah, just picking up on the Mamdani, New York situation, Brad Lander, who really is sort of a avatar for J Street. He's a real true progressive who's a liberal Zionist and has all the right politics and values, and is backing Mamdani. And he said that it's just so critical that the liberal Zionist camp and the non-Zionist camp demonstrate that there is a possibility that we can work together and disagree fundamentally on one thing, but work together because there's so much more at stake, and there are larger issues, and there are larger challenges, and real serious threats that we face. And if we aren't working together, if we're divided, our chances of beating back those threats are much lower. And so, yes, I'm glad to hear that this is beginning to change a little bit in some campus environments, and certainly at the Brad Lander, New York City mayoral race level, it needs to happen as well. Matan, I want to come back to you about Michigan specifically. I know that last spring, I think it was last spring, the university shuttered its DEI program, and it had a whole strategic DEI initiative. The Trump administration came in, it pressured Michigan, and I'm just curious now that you're back and that program is shuttered. What do you sense is the impact of that gap, of that vacuum on students? And does it leave Jewish students also with fewer resources?
For sure. Just one quick point on the previous topic, which is
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
I think just as Jeremy, you said before, there's like going to be a reckoning in the Jewish community, Jewish institutions and leaders about what the war in Gaza means and what we said. I also think, going back to the article in the Atlantic, like there should be a reckoning about um, what seems like just a too many litmus tests and a lack of pragmatism in the pro-Palestinian movements. And I think there's unfortunately a lot of truth to some of what was written in that article. And Hannah, I'm really glad to hear that like some of that's starting to change. I haven't really seen it yet at Michigan, but I am optimistic that it'll happen. Um, and I think that, there's sort of just a dual reckoning that needs to happen for how we can really just come together, Jews, Arabs, Palestinians, Israelis, everyone, and just fight for justice and peace together, um, and combat, this moment of authoritarianism in America and everything in between. As far as DEI, speaking of all those things, yeah, you're right. Our DEI program was ended in the spring of last semester. It's actually interesting that the president of our university um, ended up, he ended the DEI program, then tried to go to University of Florida, and then they didn't want to hire him because he had been associated with DEI in the past, which I thought was ironic. Um, but yeah, there are people definitely being impacted. It's hard to tell right now which programs are no longer just under the label of DEI, but still have function, like certain interfaith efforts and resources for for people who need them. Um, it's hard to get a sense of exactly what has been cut and what hasn't, even though the DEI itself as a program no longer exists. But there's no question that the Trump administration, their goal is to attack all of these initiatives and to use their leverage to force universities to capitulate, which, it's unfortunate that it's happening. And and it's even just an attack on, forget the theory behind it, like just the words diversity, equity, and inclusion on its own is that's under attack. And it's a scary time.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing. I also just wanted to add that Harvard's seen very similar attacks on our program. So over the summer, very abruptly, we were informed that our Women's Center was shuttered, as well as the LGBTQ Center. Um, so abruptly, in fact, that friends who worked at these various centers who were as student employees, not only had they not heard, but I actually happened to run into a few days after the Women's Center was shuttered, one of the high level employees, and she knew as much as I did, which was nothing. So, sort of with very little notice to the student community or the professionals who work there, our women's center was closed. It's in the basement of one of the dorms, and you can't enter it. Right. And so that has been really jarring, and has been, I think, one of the biggest shifts we've seen. And I know a lot of students are very actively sort of grappling with that because these spaces, they had a sense of power that you could show up and show up with your identity, but it also wasn't just impacting students from that identity group. But for instance, Women's Center had free snacks, and it was the only place on campus that as a student you could get free printing, and they would host events for people of all genders. And while the staff hasn't been fired, it's similarly to Matan, what it sounds like the situation is at your school. There's a lot of opaqueness as to what will happen next, how the scope, these offices were essentially collapsed into one, this of community and belonging, but it's very unclear, even to the staff members who've been reassigned, what this office will do. Certainly, it won't be as explicit in its advocacy for and programming for women and LGBTQ students, but it sort of pains me to think that, I've been here, this is my 4th year. When I came onto campus, I had all these resources to explore my identity, to come together with students of all identities, get free snacks, get free printing, and the freshmen, in a very real, tangible sense, don't have that, and they don't have these communities where they can find each other and have friendly faces to advocate for them. So that really does sadden me. And furthermore, for a school like Harvard that has gained a reputation for standing up to the Trump administration, the tax on higher education, which has been so incredible. And I've been so proud of the school for doing that. But to take that stance and at the same time be making these quiet capitulations without transparency, it just sort of confuses me and doesn't seem like a smart strategy. You're in or you're not. We're winning in court. Let's not make capitulations that are against our values as a school, and let's move forward.
And Hannah, just quickly on Princeton, Chris Eisgruber, who is was at Princeton at the same time I was, long time ago. He's actually had a pretty good national reputation for the way that he has led the way and really sort of modeled how to resist and to stand up. I'm curious how that's playing on campus. How do students regard? Rarely does a university president have a great reputation with the students. So I'm curious what what the reputation is for him, and is that respected on campus, what he's been doing nationally?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I am really, really happy that like, I feel so awful for what's going on at Harvard, but I am also so grateful that we have not experienced the same like level of cuts and changes. We still have our DEI programs for now. We are experiencing some funding cuts, and that has in fact impacted levels of student employment, library hours, and some various programs, as I've mentioned before. But compared to other universities, I really do think that we are in a relatively good spot. And I'm honestly just proud to say that I'm at an institution where he went on the New York Times Daily podcast and said that we will defend academic freedom and free speech and due process rights of the university, and we will not bend to the will of the Trump administration. There's a new program called Stand Up Princeton that is encouraging alumni to get behind this fight too. And like I said, I really am really grateful for him. That being said, while I think that he handled the encampment much better than most other university presidents, he was not called to testify before Congress, and I really think he toed the line almost as best as you can between free speech and protecting students from anti-Semitism. When you asked about student perceptions, it's interesting what students tend to think about and prioritize in their minds. And I know people in the progressive community who really, really dislike him for the dozen students who were arrested, and the charges were eventually, I don't know if they were dropped, but these students ultimately didn't face a severe consequences, but were in a court system proceeding for quite a few months. And were not able to walk at graduation for the few who are graduating seniors. And people are still very hung up on this. And I understand that. But I, at the same time, really do admire him for the work that he's doing to stand up for the Trump administration. And I wish that students, again, my big J Street phrase is, can we hold two truths at once in this room? And I wish students would appreciate him a little bit more for what he's currently doing, and maybe think about, he was navigating a very tough position that I think could have gone a lot worse. I mean, when we look at Columbia and we look at the university presidents who ultimately stepped down, that did not happen. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for navigating that as best as he did.
And I apologize to all for the shameless Princeton plug that I just made there by setting you up for that. But let me wrap things up here. We have really enjoyed having you all on Word on the Street, and invite all of our viewers and listeners to share this conversation broadly, because I think it's really important for the reality of campus life through the eyes and experience of actual students to be the center of the conversation. And I think too often the conditions on campus are turned into a political talking point, not just by senators and congresspeople who are holding hearings, but just at dinner tables and in Jewish communal conversations. And I think that the lack of connection to the real experience is doing a real disservice. And so I want to give you each a chance for a final comment. And specifically, I'd love to get your final thoughts on that gap, and what can we be doing as J Street to try to help other national organizations, organizations you may be affiliated with in other ways, to try to recognize that this isn't the 1938 Vienna, and then buildings aren't being burned, and Jewish students aren't walking in fear. What more could we be doing to try to get this reality out there, and any other advice you have for our listeners today? And so I will start with you, Matan. I'll go to Tova and then come back to Hannah, and we'll wrap things up. Matan.
Yeah, you're right. There's definitely, I mean, not just on campuses. I mean, in the Middle East, there's different realities that it feels like people are experiencing, and what, empirically is being observed just by the people that see the same thing and come to a different conclusion. And so that's difficult to navigate. And there's generational divides, um, and there's divides, even within our own generation about how we view what's happening on campus, um, or in Israel or Gaza or the West Bank. And ultimately, I think, we have to come at it from empathy, um, and try and see, which I think, J Street U does a good job of doing, that the majority of people, who are invested in this in some way, whether it be campus or otherwise, are coming at it in good faith and have good intent and care about the well-being of others. And
Well, thank you, Matan. I just wrote a little bit about that in the wake of Charlie Kirk's horrific assassination, and the need to get beyond the polarization and to recognize that vast number of people who are not at these polar extremes, at the end of the day, are human beings and good human beings and have empathy, and we can build a better society grounding ourselves in that center of humankind. Tova, to you.
Yeah, I so agree with that point. A lot of my efforts last semester were based around this problem of the vast majority of students on campus are not cool, they're not violent. They might have very sometimes strongly differing views, but they sort of want the best and they're coming at it in good faith. But that's not what's being represented. Um, so I thought about, sort of this perspective of caring about campus anti-Semitism, but being really disturbed by ideological deportation, crackdowns on free speech. That's what most of myself and my peers agreed with. And I thought, well, why is no one speaking out about that? And then I thought, okay, well, I'm not speaking out about that. I can't really, you know, feel morally superior. And so I think it's about on our end as students and as people who care about students, finding ways to elevate student voices who are actually affected. I think the quiet majority of people who have reasonable yet differing views, I think oftentimes that's not what is selected for in the media environment. And just quite frankly, like we're students, we're young, we have thoughts, but don't always know how to translate them into cohesive talking points. We don't know how to give media interviews. I had to learn not to flail my hands around, which I sometimes fail at. But small things like that, it seems deceptively simple, and I think that can make a big impact. So for an organization like J Street or any of you watching, I think just try to find ways to empower young people to seek those voices who have really powerful stories but are maybe afraid to share them or don't know how. For instance, there's a Ukrainian student on campus who her visa was revoked this summer because international students had their visas revoked from Harvard. And she had just turned in her documents to the Polish embassy to, get her visa renewed. And they took her passport and didn't return it and, sort of put it under administrative review. So for a few days, she was actually stateless and had to sleep in the Ukrainian embassy. And so she had this really powerful story, but hadn't really publicly spoken or shared it. And at the most recent Students for Freedom rally, she shared her story and it got a lot of sort of attention and impact because when people simply listen and hear these student stories, it matters and it starts to shift the narrative. President Trump was even asked at a press conference a question about, oh, students who are rallying on Harvard's campus, what do you say to them? And so I think bit by bit, if we as institutions try to uplift and train students to speak out, which I know is something that J Street, that's your bread and butter. And I think as students trying to help each other be brave, find others like us who care, and sort of work to amplify each other and uplift each other, I think sort of that's the best any of us can do to try to move the needle.
Thanks so much, Tova. Hannah, over to you for a final word.
Yeah, I think that honestly, do more things like this. Listen to your Jewish students that you know, your grandkids, your children, their peers of yours who are here right now, who are experiencing this. It was highlighted earlier that so much of what is on the media is on the extremes and it's not on the average person. And so, just like for an example, if you see, oh, someone said this anti-Semitic slur at this uh, SJP encampment or rally or protest, that is wrong and that should be condemned and that should be dealt with. But that the majority of the students at that protest, I really believe, even if we have fundamental disagreements, they are there because they care about humanity and they care about people's safety. And that is important. We, as Jewish students, have those same shared values. And we on our campuses are working towards building those bridges and hopefully educating and understanding that, like, this isn't that we need to come together in the same room and talk about these things, and that's hard right now. But at the end of the day, Matan brought up empathy. I think that we need to have more empathy for those around us who we disagree with, and not just assume that what we see on the media or what we see in emails from universities are speaking the whole truth. So really provide more opportunities for Jewish students to share with you. And when you see things like think about what think about alternative perspectives. I'll end there.
Terrific. Well, I just can't thank the three of you enough. We're getting a lot of really wonderful compliments and kudos in the chat. People just are inspired by all of you and your vision, your leadership, your values. And I hope that folks who are watching this will share the conversation. It'll be available on all your favorite podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and here on Substack on Word on the Street. And we really do want to get these voices out there, as all three of you have been saying. So thank you very, very much. Keep up the great work. And I know that I will see you at some point soon down the road. I appreciate all three of you very much. Thank you.